You have to observe the reality, no matter how uncomfortable it is, that you know, Seth Rogen, Joe Rogan, whatever, right? Somebody's going to say something that's going to piss you off. Right? You ain't like, you know, I'm completely ignorant of the whole finer points of it. Free speech is problematic. You may like guns, you may hate guns. The Second Amendment exists, right? You may not like having, you know, people given fair trials when they're assholes, right? Those are rights and responsibilities that come with a democracy that runs by a constitution. It's hard. Theme I'll keep coming back to. Being a democracy is hard. And as a result, enforcing these requires people to take the initiative to point out when they are injustices. And Homer Plessy is a perfect example of that. Homer Plessy is a 20-something. He's a member of the NAACP. He is, will be soon, an activist in regards to that. He is somebody who is listening to the voice, and he is in essence recognizing that in the state of Louisiana where he lives, there is segregation of different railroad cars based on the number of pigments, whether you're Pinky Peach or not, right? And it runs counter to what the Constitution says. And what Homer Plessy does is to, in essence, ride in the white section of a railroad car and outs himself. He purposefully gets arrested. Civil disobedience, right? Goes back to, you know, whatever, Walden and you know, Thoreau and all of these sort of civil disobedience against slavery in the 1820s, 1830s, is picked up again in the modern civil rights movement. This is a political woodcut, right? So it's used in newspapers. Here's the scenario, right? You know, this you know, kind of African American. That's not what he looked like, right? This is Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy could pass. He had Pinky Peach in his background. He could look like a white person. And as a result, he is going to purposely break the law. It goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, in essence, you've got this in front of you. You've got the Constitution, which says everyone must be treated equally, must be given due process of the law. And what inarguably is the worst Supreme Court ruling, at least Brown v. Board is going to rule that, of this period of time, what Plessy versus Ferguson does is to say, I know we live in a democracy, I know we have a constitution, but because people see race, because it's important to people and they feel like they need to be above someone else based on skin tone, because of these social conditions, we're not going to enforce the law. We simply are not going to do it. We're not going to enforce the provisions of the Constitution. And separate but equal, again, the question is how equal is it, is perfectly acceptable. Blonky, you can segregate class. If you got a thing against, you know, you want all the guys in front, all the girls in back, and you grade them, that's all right. That's separate but equal facilities, right? It is inherently un-American. It is inherently anti-constitutional. But it also reflects this idea of saying, in essence, we see these problems, we see this social construction of race, and we're simply going to allow our legal system to follow from that, right? One race is inferior to the other socially. The Constitution of the United States cannot put them in the same place. That is wrong, right? Well, you know, I see socially that so-and-so shouldn't own a gun, right? Who cares what you think? I don't care about your opinion about whether or not someone should or shouldn't. Here's what the Second Amendment says, right? The Supreme Court is in essence deferring and saying, well, we can't change racial views in American society. What this does, and by the way, if you ever go to New Orleans, New Orleans is a great city, I love New Orleans. Down, you know, picking your hurricanes and what have you, down in Bourbon Street and all that. Just across from the main drag is called St. Louis. It's a St. Louis cemetery. Number one, you know, it's below sea level, and as a result, all the burials are above ground, right? So they have crypts or whatever. You can do a tour of this. It's really kind of cool, right? It's a great way to burn up hangover. But there's all this kind of voodoo shit in there. I mean, it's just really bizarre. You're walking through it. But Plessy's grave is in there. And you know, he's a freedom rider. He's a guy who's in essence making an argument that says, as an American, I would rather go to jail and defend the Constitution than to basically, well, it's going to inconvenience me, and I really don't care if the American Constitution is enforced or not. What it does is give a green light to any state that wants to pass legislation that is now going to use the same kind of language of separate but equal. We can have separate but equal voting rights. We can have separate but equal housing rights. We can have separate but equal education, medical, right? And I'm not gonna stand up here, you guys know this as well as I do, I'm not gonna stand up here and just talk about the last 120 years where you can look and see economically, medically, opportunity-wise, right? There is segregation, there is racism in this country. The question to you is, here's objective evidence, which I could bring in tons of it to demonstrate this. You either look at that objective evidence and go, yeah, that ain't right, or you don't. And the question becomes, why do you say, I'm just gonna ignore them? What is it about your values that is, what are you defending, right? Because evidence is evidence, right? What you conclude with it is a totally different story. But in essence, what it does is, beginning in 1898, you begin to see segregation take place across the country. Again, not just the bad old South, it's in Chicago, it's in New York, it's all over the place, right? And using racial ideology, using this kind of social construction, is going to put an entire subset of the American population behind economically, socially, medically, et cetera, et cetera. The cost of this is obvious. Again, it's not a question of looking at the scholarship, looking at, mention one coming up. We are, again, in the second Gilded Age, asking the same kinds of questions. Who gets to vote? What do they have to do in order to vote? What it does do is give a green light, an okay, a social okay for people to construct the argument if, as on its face, if segregation, racism, whatever, discrimination is unconstitutional, as it is, then how can you defend it? Well, the only way a rational person, and you use that word in air quotes, is going to defend it is by saying they deserve it, right? And what emerges very quickly is progressive racism, is, young African-American men are just interested in sexual relations with white women. Young African-American women just interested in having babies and being independent, right? We are going to develop in this country eugenics laws, sterilization policies. This is a book over in Bell Library, published 1933, right? That says about eugenics. And eugenics is, in essence, sterilizing or killing people who you don't want to see reproducing. Eugenic sterilization laws and segregation in certain groups is making steady headway. National population policy would be inadequate, which did not include plans for increasing the effectiveness and sound efforts to prevent the births among the unfit. Who are the unfit? Well, in this case, it's constructed in terms of racial categorization. When we get to the Nazis, when we get to World War II, where do you think the Nazis looked to figure out sterilization and eugenics policies for the Jews? They looked to the United States, because this is coming out of the US. And what it does, very much as we're going to see with the Nazis, is it gets turned into an argument of cultural affinity. Here's who I am, culturally. Right? I'm a native-born white male, and I have presence. I'm a native-born Protestant white man. And you see the Klan kind of have this second iteration, and it's national. I mentioned before, my grandfather is in seminary school. He's going to become a Lutheran minister. In Kansas, he has a Klan, he has a fiery cross in front of his yard because he's an immigrant, right? Because he's not a Catholic, but it could have been because he's Catholic, because he's Jewish. It now becomes culturally acceptable to begin to target individuals and say, you're different from us, and we are going to make sure we can do what we want with you. If you're jogging in the wrong neighborhood, we can shoot you dead, right? We have the right to do that. And this gives a green light. Why is it important to stomp that shit out when it appears? Because all it does is to give a green light to others. And in the 1890s, what you see for the next 30 years is an open invitation for basically mob violence. Judge Lynch, right? And you can see this ain't in just the bad old Texas. One of the books I read way back when I was in grad school, A Dark Journey to Mississippi. It is one of the most darkest depictions. I mean, you go through in terms of Louis Hobart, most fiendish tortures at the hands of what? Chopped off his fingers and ears. Is burned alive. This is an account, again, this is in the Corpus Christi Caller, 1899, about Sam Hose, African-American who was charged with the most violent crime, killing a white man, killing his boss. I could give you the background if we had more time, but whatever. He was not given a trial by jury, right? He didn't have a cop sit on his neck for 7 minutes, but he was burned at the stake at a public road 1.5 miles from here this afternoon. Before the torch was applied to the fire, the Negro was deprived of his ears, fingers, and other portions of his anatomy. So what typically happened is that these men were tied to trees, and stripped naked. Other portions of his anatomy, his genitalia, all right? So he's castrated on the spot in front of 1,000 people, right? The Negro pleaded piteously for his life while the mutilation was going on. What's happening here? Ritualistic torture. Remember ISIS? Remember how like ISIS is cutting people's heads off? That is ritualistic torture. That is using violence to say, I control your body. I control everything about you. I can do this because you are wrong, because you're evil. W. Du Bois, the souls of black folk. Something is wrong with me because I'm not, I'm not a native-born white. Before the body was cool, so they burned him alive. Before the body was cool, it was cut to pieces and the bones were crushed into small bits. The Negro's heart was cut into several pieces, as was his liver. Those unable to obtain a ghastly relic paid more fortunate possessors extravagant sums. Small pieces of bone went for 25 cents and a bit of the liver crisply cooked sold for 10 cents each, right? What's going on here? The same, again, you don't want to make these kind of false analogies of Twitter and whatnot, but it's that same green light to say, I can say whatever I want. I can denigrate you as an American based on my values, on who you vote for, on what kind of clothes you wear, whether wear your baseball hat backwards, right? That is not what the Constitution provides for. That's what these individuals, and again, she's older here, Ida Wells, is, I think, 32 years old when she's involved in this, is focusing on this as an anti-lynching campaign. And some of these, you look at American history, close to 10,000 Americans are going to be ritualistically killed without trial, right? Again, they may be Jeffrey Dahmer, we don't know, because they never had a trial. They never were put to a jury of their peers, right? Rape is the cause of lynching. 87 women are going to be lynched as well in the same environment. And it spurs this notion of retribution, of physical retribution. The effects of this, by the time we get to the 20th century, is reaching out and crushing opposition wherever they may find it. Obviously, more recently, people are more familiar with Tulsa, Oklahoma, Tulsa racetrack, right? The Black Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. Historians have long known about this, right? And in cities that you would consider to be sort of black centers, Atlanta, Chicago, Springfield, right? A city that is renowned for being the home of Abraham Lincoln, Chicago, Houston, etc. What it does is sort of settle this issue culturally, whereas if you look at the Reconstruction era, you look at radical Republicans and Reconstruction, that is not their intent. Their intent is to say the Civil War forces Americans to, in essence, understand that it's difficult in this country to grant everyone equal rights. But that is exactly what 13, 14, and 15 is about. What you see in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s is a reversal of that. And oh, by the way, that is when all the statues go up. That is when all the Robert E. Lee statues, they don't go up by these people who fought the war, Southerners who fought the war. They go up by their kids who are saying, I'll be damned if I'm not going to honor somebody who fought for, the glorious cause of the old Confederacy. Right? Again, I'm the first person as a cultural historian. Stars and bars sometimes, the Confederate battle flag, just sometimes mean, they did when I was growing up, they're just beer drinking chickens, right? I mean, it's sort of the Jason Aldean thing. Gonna go mudding this weekend. I'm gonna go raise some hell. Hell yeah, that's what it should stand for, right? I'm all for that. But when it stands for this idea of, well, we're going to push back the meaning of what the war was and the meaning of what the Constitution is, that undermines America. That's not acceptable. That's not good, right? In a democracy. And a democracy has to turn around and go, we're not just allowing this, right? You either do it or you don't. Every generation is going to face that. So this third way we'll leave for a session because we'll come back to it later on. But conclusions, these are social constructions. There's no biology. There certainly isn't a legal aspect of this, and there certainly isn't an economic one. It is what society says. When I was your age, the idea of homosexuals marrying was never, no politician in the span of 4 or 5 years. What you see is a social change to say, hey, two adults doing whatever the hell they want to do, why not? What do I have to say about that? Those are social constructions. There's nothing that guarantees it, right? This changes during this period of time as we modernize, as we become a society that is dealing with all kinds of economic pressures, right? 1910s African Americans, You're gonna see this focus on African Americans, not because Mexican Americans or Asian Americans or Filipino, whatever, are less important, but African Americans are here longer, and they're in this mix going back to literally before the United States existed, right? And as a result, their narrative tends to be kind of trailblazing. Certainly a large population, 11% of the American population is black. And so it designates a component of society. The modern civil rights movement has begun. Right? Martin Luther King ain't born yet. And it doesn't just pop up when all of a sudden he gives a speech in Washington, D.C. Anti-immigrant feelings, I know I didn't talk about this much, are largely clamped down because of the two wars that are approaching, World War I and World War II. And in between World War I and World War II, the United States goes into an economic depression. So there's not an appeal for immigrants to come to this country. And in fact, we're leaving this country during this period of time. So anti-immigrant feelings are kind of put on hold, and World War II, as we're going to see, is going to have a real deep influence on this sort of inclusive idea of what the United States stands for. Melting pot becomes much more socially desirable following World War II. Everybody is kind of fashioned into an American citizen. Nativism is very closely picked. It isn't just this bad old, former Confederates and Johnny Reb. This is going to be picked up and brought into higher education, 4 out of 5 doctors kind of stuff. Progressives are going to see this equally as forcefully as someone who you would kind of see in your mind's eye as being, sort of a deliverance kind of character. Ignorant rural people. They're not the ones with power. The ones with power are supporting this view just as strong. Again, I know it's harsh stuff, and it's a difficult history of American society, but it's clearly connected to the ways in which we see ourselves in terms of the Constitution. If, as I argued on the very first day of class, the only reasonable definition of America is the U.S. Constitution, then not supporting the U.S. Constitution is, by definition, un-American. Right? Plain and simple. Or you can say, no, it's open, and we're going to change this, and we're going to get rid of, democracy and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's a different story. But as it exists,